McQuestion. For over 25 years, talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuestion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, CF Accountants and Consultants, adding value to clients throughout the region, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Like many subjects we've covered in the last 25 years, the right to vote and the requirements for doing so are important topics indeed. On this program, we'll ask whether requiring certain specific identification before one can vote is a good idea. You may be saying to yourself right now, well, duh, of course it's a good idea. On the other hand, you may be saying, no way. The idea of voter ID discriminates against some voters. Well, you won't be surprised to know that we have experts on both sides of this argument, so let's meet them now. First, starting on my left, is Tom Pauken. Tom is former chairman of the Texas Workforce Commission, an unsuccessful candidate for Congress in your far past, and you were in the Reagan administration, which was probably a good experience for you. And you've been around these kind of issues forever, so welcome back to the program, Tom.
Good to be with you, Dennis.
Thank you. And sitting next to him is Elizabeth Alvarez Bingham. She's the vice chairman of the Dallas County Republican Party, and she has her own law practice. Elizabeth, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you. And next to you is Linda Wassenich. She's on the board and chair of the Development Committee of the League of Women Voters at the national level. While active in many civic organizations, she's been involved with the League of Women Voters since 1970. I assume you started in grade school. Is that right, Linda? Good. Thank you for all your service in trying to get people educated on voting.
Thank you.
And last but not least is Matt Engel. He was the chief of staff to former Congressman Martin Frost. He was executive director of the House Democratic Caucus. And in 2005, he founded the Lone Star Project, which you're going to tell us about in a few minutes. So Matt, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dennis. Good to be here.
And before we go to all of you and some people sitting behind me here to talk about this issue, we have a part of a video called Pay to Play. We're just going to play the first minute or so of it. So if you're ready for that video 14, let's run it right now.
This hysteria over voter fraud, this really non-existence voter fraud, has been used to intimidate and disenfranchise voters and to actually pass measures that block out millions of eligible voters.
These guys are covering for now is voter ID. That's the new election theft mechanism.
Ground zero right now is probably Pennsylvania, where this strict photo ID law, which says that you aren't going to be able to vote unless you show up with a government-issued ID.
Unless you have a state-approved, state-issued photo ID, a very narrow type of ID that some 22 million Americans do not have, you cannot cast your vote on election day at the polling place.
And it's been struck down in Texas, it's been struck down in several other states, but it's still in effect there, and there's 800,000 voters in that state who don't have an up-to-date current ID.
Tell me, voter suppression or is this voter protection?
Definitely voter protection. I think every American citizen deserves to have their vote protected from the forces of corruption.
Well, there are two sides of that issue. The biggest side there was obviously suppression in that particular video. Matt, tell us what voter ID is and why we're talking about it so much these days, especially leading up to a big election in 2016.
Well, in its purest sense, it is the assurance that the person who is voting is who they say they are. However, that concern and that relative simple concept that most people agree with has been distorted and used as a tool by the leaders in this state and leaders in other states to suppress vote, to keep people who otherwise would vote from having the opportunity to do so. It's pretty straightforward that it's been used as a suppression tool.
Okay, and who would be using this tool to suppress? Tell us names here.
Well, here in Texas, leaders, particularly Republican leaders, had a decision to make. As the state's population changed, as it converted from being a majority Anglo state to a majority black plus Hispanic plus Asian state, they had a choice to make. They could either broaden their message in order to win the support of new Latino voters, new African American voters, and other new Texans coming in. They could either broaden their support in order to win those votes, or they could take actions to keep those people from voting. They chose the latter. To use voter ID and other voter restrictions to limit the number of people who could participate in elections in order to gain and hold on to power into the future.
Okay, now Elizabeth, for some reason you were shaking your head.
Look, I'm sorry, but that kind of language is disgraceful. The Democrats invested a massive amount of money in this last election cycle, and they were shown the door by demographics of all kinds in this state. Hispanics are voting anywhere from half to 2/3 for Republican candidates. There is no outward rejection of a Republican message, and there's no reason why Republicans wouldn't want Hispanics to vote. John Cornyn carried Hispanics. Dan Patrick carried Hispanics. We had congressional candidates in open races where they were redistricted. There was an instance here in Texas where an incumbent Hispanic Democrat was rejected by a Hispanic district overwhelmingly in favor of a Republican Anglo. Why? Because race is not an issue to Hispanics. This is an example of what happens when people run out of ideas, Dennis. They're tired of losing. They have no positive policies to offer that help increase the mobility and the access to economic growth for these communities like Republicans do. Charter schools, energy development, all of these types of issues are wildly popular in the Hispanic community and have led to them voting increasingly for Republicans. So instead of trying to come up with new ideas, they're happy to beat the drum of the specter of racism as long as anyone will listen.
Matt, you probably don't totally agree with what she
Well,
said.
I appreciate her passion. I don't appreciate her inaccuracy. The truth of the matter is there is no competitive race in this entire state where a Republican candidate, whether they were Latino or Anglo, won a majority of the Latino vote. That's simply not true. In 2014, fewer Latinos cast votes than they did in 2012 or in 2010. What the Republicans are looking at is sometimes percentages. Well, they're getting a higher percentage of a lower turnout. That's their game. Their game is to keep the turnout low so that they can win a higher percentage of a low turnout. That's what they do, not only in Texas, but across the country as you've got Latino populations increasing. If they really wanted Latino votes, they would be expanding the Latino voting base, not retracting it.
Well, Linda, you can see why I placed you where I did.
Yes.
So, talk to us. I mean, you've heard the pros and cons here.
Well, my own personal opinion is that voter ID is driven by the perception that there is a lot of fraud, at least as far as investigative reporting that the Dallas Morning News did about 2007, 2008. They found, after it was then Attorney General Ken Abbott who ran that study, they found that, and I should add, they looked at voting records in 44 counties, all counties with 100,000 or more population, and any county that had a history of voter fraud. They pulled out 26 cases, of which 18 had a homebound person's ballot cast, put in the mailbox by someone else who failed to sign the outside of the envelope. The remaining 8 would not have been solved by voter ID. They did not involve voter impersonation. One person voted her mother's ballot. One person, there were various problems, but 8 out of however many millions of votes they looked at is not anything to talk about.
So voter ID appears to be an issue in source of a problem. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's the cliche that I've used in describing it. And I think it's a problem on both sides of the fence. I do think that there's some history, or there's some indications that voter ID is more popular in states that have Republican governors and Republican legislators.
Mm-hmm. All right. Tom, we taped a program recently on voter fraud. I think we made the case that there is a lot of it, has been a lot of it, hopefully less of it now, may or may not be significant. Where are you on this issue?
Well, Matt's really trying to frame the debate. by talking about voter ID as because of the Republicans' desire to suppress votes. That's ludicrous. The reality is it's the history of voter fraud in our state and across the nation, which warrants making sure that there's an honest and true count of people who actually are registered to vote, who vote. And that's what voter ID is all about. I think back to a Hispanic Democrat friend of mine who was complaining a few years ago. He was for Hillary Clinton against Barack Obama, and he was saying, a whole bunch of people showed up at our caucus and they didn't have any voter ID. They didn't have any identification on them. I mean, it's a very fair and simple process. It's not voter suppression. It's a desire for an honest count, and there is systematic voter fraud that has taken place in this state and across the nation for decades.
All right, I'm going to look at what Texas actually requires. So let's look at graphic number 2 and we'll talk about that. And Texas requires one of these photo IDs in order to vote. And that's a driver's license, a personal identification card, concealed handgun license, election identification certificate, passport, military identification card, citizenship certificate or naturalization certificate with a photograph. That's what it requires. Now, I'm standing here with Renee Martinez. And Renee, you sort of agree with some of these people up here. You've been involved in this issue for a long time. Talk to us.
Well, I think the voter turnout issue, Texas has, what is it, Matt, 2% less turnout based on history, the most recent voter turnout. A lot of people are not going to have all those types of identification.
Wait a minute, they just have to have one type of them.
I understand. Some will not have any. I have only 3 or 4. I don't have a concealed weapons license. I'm not military. I have a driver's license. I have a passport. A lot of elderly don't have passports. A lot of elderly don't have driver's license. A lot of elderly are not in college. So what are we going to do with that element in the community? College students, I understand college IDs are not allowed. Some college students do not have driver's license. Some college students may not have birth certificates based on what the state of Texas is doing. So what are you going to do with them? So there's going to be a big chunk of folks, distance, being able to obtain those Texas IDs. You're going to have to drive, not around the block, but you're going to have to, in rural areas, miles and miles and miles to obtain those type of IDs. And if you're 70, 75 years old, 80 years old, what are you going to do with that?
Okay, great question, Renee. Thank you. Let's look at graphic number 1. I'm going to show you what does require photo ID. So if we're ready with graphic number 1, buying alcohol, cigarettes, opening a bank account, applying for food stamps, welfare, Medicare, Social Security, unemployment, rent or buy a house, drive or buy or rent a car, get on an airplane, get married, purchase a gun, adopt a pet, rent a hotel room, apply for a hunting license, apply for a fishing license, visit a casino, pick up a prescription, hold a rally or protest, blood donations, buy an M-rated video game, I don't know what that is, purchase nail polish at CVS, and purchase certain cold medicines in interstate and federal buildings. Now, I got to tell you something, Matt, with all due respect, if you have to do all those 25 things with the voter ID, why not voting for
Well,
heaven's
here's the
sake?
difference. Almost all of those things, it's up to the discretion of the person who you're doing the interaction with. Anybody can, I've gotten on an airplane without a photo ID because I was willing to sign an affidavit that I was who I said I was. That's not allowed in the voting booth. But there's something else important, and it goes to Tom's point. That is that Republican leaders in this state had an opportunity to approve amendments that would have expanded the types of IDs that would have been available to voters. They rejected those alternatives. Democrats would have supported voter photo ID had those alternatives been made. They didn't do it. That's why a federal court with Republican judges on it found that the current Texas voter law was discriminatory.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Actually, it didn't find that it was intentionally discriminatory.
I didn't say intentional.
Well, no, it found that in a very limited and narrow scope, if they expanded the to a few additional number of types of IDs, that the law would be totally constitutional. So I find it interesting that you come out here arguing that asking, just the idea that we should ask people to identify themselves is driven by racism. But if you had just allowed a couple of extra IDs, we totally would have been okay with that.
No,
so those two ideas just simply don't match. And to be honest, part of the Republican legislature's ideas when they passed these laws was to make it easier to obtain these laws. And as someone who is Hispanic, and I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, if we're talking about adults who want to function fully in society, and you come to me and tell me I don't have an ID, the first thing in my mind is not going to be, well, obviously the government is suppressing you, but why don't you have one, and what can we do to get you one so that you can fully engage in society as an adult? And using race and class as some sort of excuse to prevent people from fully engaging in society does not help them. It doesn't help the Hispanic community either.
Okay, Matt?
Well, let me respond in a couple of ways. First of all, it's not accurate that the court found that the law was probably okay. A federal judge did find it to be intentionally discriminatory. In fact, they called she called it a poll tax.
You're right, and the Fifth Circuit appellate court struck that down.
Upheld her finding of discrimination.
No, they did not.
Yes, they did.
There were 4 claims on the appellate level, and the poll tax was expressly rejected.
We will get the boxing gloves later, but
let me go further. This is not driven by racism. What it is driven by political greed. It's driven by a political party that does not want to give up any of their power.
Now, let me ask you a question. Is that only Republicans that don't want to give up power, or would the Democrats be different?
Well, I can tell you that Democrats have, when they've had power, done things to hold on to power.
Exactly.
There are not instances of them using institutional discrimination to do so.
You mean like redistricting?
All right. Now, I have, wait a minute, Tom, hold on. This is Jason's, now, Jason, you're stepping into a hornet's nest here. Jason's a lawyer, too, with Bell Nunley, so talk to us about this issue.
Well, I'm familiar with the case. The district court found that there was intentional discrimination as part of passing the law to begin with, and that there was also a discriminatory impact from the law. Found the extensive evidence was put on. One of the things that the court found was that there were about 600,000 Texas voters who didn't have the required ID to be able to vote, who would not be able to vote. There was also evidence that these kinds of laws would discourage people from voting even when they had ID. And then there was also, the state had the opportunity to put on evidence of voter fraud. And of course, voter ID only addresses in-person voter fraud. And the state had the opportunity to put on all the evidence it had of this being a problem, and the court found that there just really wasn't any, that it wasn't a big enough problem. In-person voter fraud, which is the only thing that voter ID can solve, there wasn't enough evidence there to make that a good enough reason to pass a law like this. The Court of Appeals did reverse the intentional discrimination finding only because it found that the district court relied on some evidence of intentional discrimination that it shouldn't have relied on. But it sent it back to the district court to reconsider whether there was intentional discrimination, and that still could be a finding the district court could make. The Fifth Circuit affirmed the finding of discriminatory impact, saying this does discriminate in the effect that it has, in that minority groups and other groups are discouraged from voting with a law like this. That doesn't make it unconstitutional. It was a violation of the Voting Rights Act. They didn't reach the constitutional question, so whether it's constitutional or not is still sort of out there.
Well, Jason, well said. And you can hold on to this microphone, but be careful with it. You can sit down right over there. Thank you very much. Okay, Tom, you're up.
Well, Matt talks about power and whose interest it is. I mean, he worked for Martin Frost, and back in the old days, the late Dan Weiser drew the maps for redistricting and did it for decades. And it was designed, if you will, to maximize the impact of liberal Democrats winning marginal districts. And in fact, the minority community got so upset about some of the things that were being done locally that a few of us, Frank Hernandez representing Hispanics, myself representing Al Lipscomb, Elsie Faye Higgins, J.B. Jackson, and a number of other blacks went in to object to those lines that had been drawn by Dan Weiser working closely with Martin Frost. So it was about power, to maximize the impact of liberal Democrats, white liberal Democrats getting elected, as opposed to minority members, and dividing communities of interest. So it's a lot of it is whose ox is being gored.
I am shocked. I am shocked to hear something like that. But I'll bet you, Matt, you probably have another view of that, given who did the last redistricting.
What I can tell you is that the last time that Democrats controlled the process was in 1991. Texas at that time went from 27 to 30 congressional districts. Those 3 new congressional districts, 2 of them were drawn to allow Latinos to elect their candidate of choice, and one of them was drawn to allow an African American to elect their candidate of choice. During 2011, the last time the Republicans redo districts, Texas got 4 new congressional districts. When it was over with, the net number of districts that blacks or Hispanics could elect the candidate of their choice was -1. They not only didn't provide any of the 4 new districts to Democrats, but they took away 1.
Well, which is why perhaps we need to have a nonpartisan stuff doing redistricting sometime. League of Women Voters, what are you guys doing in trying to educate people about, first of all, how they get registered if they need to get registered? What are you doing, Linda? Help us with this, because if we just had everybody registered who wants to register, we wouldn't have these people arguing over you.
Well, it's a serious problem. One of the things that I think is quite innovative is that the League of Women Voters is preparing a curriculum that can be added from kindergarten through 12th grade so that students are prepared in their social studies classes to understand the importance of voting, to understand why it makes a difference. Frequently people think, well, it doesn't really matter because my vote's not going to count. There's so many other people. I know it's going to go the other way, so I won't even bother to go. We hold voter registration drives. There's something called the National Voter Registration Day that's celebrated in September, and the League is part of that coalition, probably holds the largest number of specific voter registrations drives across the nation, some 400 different locations. We have assiduously tried to educate the public about what they need to bring to the polls now that we currently are under a photo ID. And that's in our voter's guide. It's in, you can check the website, lwv.org. The Texas League is lwvtexas.org. And those places are ways that people can find out what their requirements are. I think fundamentally one of the things that the League does, which we don't often talk much about, is in our study of issues, we try to present both the facts about those issues and what the disagreements or the issue part is of the subject. Right. So if you, for example, were faced with a question about water distribution, you could go to the League of Women Voters website and look at that study and become more educated about the issue, and then read the candidates' discussions on the questions that were asked them for the voter's guide. Yeah. We try to ask questions that are broadly applicable to most of the public, not something that's real esoteric and only one little group of people.
I think all of us want more educated voters, don't we? Is anybody going to argue with that? So we appreciate what you. Let's hope not. I mean, there are some people, by the way, who don't want educated voters. Do what I say on both parties, by the way. Now, Matt, very quickly, what is the Lone Star Project?
Lone Star Project is a democratic political analysis and communications and research organization working to expose the failure of one-party Republican control in Texas.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to mention one thing, and I'm going to get each of you a chance to sort of make your closing comments. But this is John Funn's book called Who's Counting? Some of you have seen it and read it. This is on page 64. Talking about, again, he wrote a book about Eric Holder as well, but talking about the hypocrisy of the Holder Justice Department. Said if you want to make an appointment to see the Attorney General, no outsider can enter the main justice headquarters building in Pennsylvania Constitution without a photo ID. And to those who would argue that voting is a constitutional right, so is speaking to government officials. The First Amendment specifically protects the right of people to petition the government for redress, but you'd have to have a photo ID to do that, Matt. In another graphic illustration of this hypocrisy, he says, an undercover video visited the offices of several liberal groups opposing voter ID laws, the Advancement Project, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the Center for American Progress, all of which require photo ID to enter their offices. So I find that entertaining. How do you address that?
Well, there's not a great objection to the concept of a photo ID. In fact, Democrats and many people in the legislature who opposed the current law would have supported it if the Republican leadership would have allowed for additional forms of ID, would have provided the money to tell people about the restrictions so that the League of Women Voters wouldn't have to spend as much time as they do having to educate people. And finally, to provide a way for free access to a birth certificate.
Okay, good. Elizabeth, you have 15 seconds to either talk about him or something else.
I think the bottom line is whether they're talking about redistricting and the right of minorities to elect the candidate of their choice or them being suppressed from voting, it all boils down to this adherence to a philosophy that minorities are somehow unique and different. They can't get an ID. They need to have a Hispanic representing them because they can't be represented by somebody who doesn't look like them. But Anglo-Americans can be, and none of that makes any sense.
You have 15 seconds, Tom.
Well, I just think it's no wonder every referendum, every poll that I see, people overwhelmingly favor voter ID. It's just common sense. And that's what we did in Texas. That's what's been done elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with that. And it is important to maintain the integrity of the ballot process.
Okay, well, thank all of you for being here. By the way, Indiana, when they instituted voter ID, their actual percentage of people who voted went up. Isn't that kind of entertaining? So, you've heard good opinions, both pro and con, and I hope you paid attention to facts, not just the opinions. Now, there will be fraud in voting as sure as I'm sitting here in front of you. And you need to decide whether a well-constructed voter ID system constitutes a good trade-off. Take a look at McQuestionTV.com, where you'll find a recent program on voter fraud that goes hand in hand with this program. Follow us on Twitter. Keep watching as you have for 25 years as we talk about things that matter with people who care.
A DVD of this program is available for $20 plus $5 postage and handling, and in Texas, applicable tax. For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email NikkiN@NikkiMcQuestion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquestiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuestionTV or download McQuestion TV video podcasts on iTunes. Production of McQuestion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, CF Accountants and Consultants, adding value to clients throughout the region, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future. Thank you for joining us in our 25th year of Conversations That Matter.